Well, Jason, as you well know, anytime there are game lines or over-unders that are released, it catches a lot of people's attention. The Vegas over-under win totals were released just a couple days ago, and Oklahoma sitting squarely on 11, meaning if you want to win some money, you are banking on Oklahoma going undefeated. Does that seem maybe a shade high from a probability standpoint, maybe?
Yeah, maybe so. From a, when you look at things from a betting line perspective, that obviously the bettors are trying to get you to play one side or the other. I think it's tough to kind of talk about, Oklahoma has not, it's been a while since they've been undefeated through the regular season. They've really, so if you bet the over, obviously on there, you're betting on a 12-0 season, and you're betting on, Oklahoma not having that slip up. And I think that's one of the things, we've talked about Oklahoma a lot. I think one of the key things, for Oklahoma is really, and this is a lot on Riley, and Riley mentioned this a couple of times, several times through the season last year, and even early on in some of his spring comments, is, having not taking their foot off the gas and having a little bit more of a bigger, killer instinct in terms of, because there's games against, obviously Kansas State last year, Kansas State the year before. They've had some losses, some to Iowa State, some a lot inexplicable losses during the regular season that they shouldn't have had. And, credit to them, every time they've been able to kind of overcome that. So if you're, certainly you're betting on Oklahoma being in a position to, overcome some of those pitfalls that they've had in the past. So, I mean, when you think about it, Oklahoma's probably going to be, well, not probably, they're going to be favored in every single game that they play this year. I think they'll probably fairly significant favorites in every single. When you think about, I think the line for Iowa State was like 8, I think, and the Texas game was like 11.5. I mean, right now, when you look at it, probably there's only one game that they will actually be a single digit favorite on. So, I mean, coming into it right now, obviously things change as the season goes through, but I think when you're looking at it on paper, you would certainly expect Oklahoma to get to that 12, to get to those 12 wins, to make it to the over. But how much do you trust them not to drop a game at some point in the year? And we've talked so much about the playoffs and how it's the same teams over and over, but I think it's really important this season for Oklahoma from a matchup perspective. You don't necessarily want to play that number one the very first game. You'd like to be in that 2-3 game. It would be hard for Oklahoma to get to that, in my opinion, to get to that 2-3 matchup if they drop a game early on in the year. So, yeah, I think it's a very tough proposition to kind of consider here, but I think you have to, based on what we've seen in the past, you almost have to expect Oklahoma maybe to drop a game that they maybe shouldn't.
If you look at college football year to year, there's typically 1, maybe 2. I think a few years ago we had 3 undefeated teams. So it's extremely difficult to go undefeated through the regular season.
Yeah,
it happens once or twice a season. Alabama was the only team to do it last year. 2019, we had LSU, Clemson, Ohio State in the regular season undefeated and through their championship game. So 1, 2, 3 teams at the most go undefeated. Now, I think anyone would be shocked if the team or teams to go undefeated this season are outside of the Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Georgia, Oklahoma 5. 2 of them play each other, Clemson and Georgia, so eliminate one of them. I think most people would be shocked if, therefore, there was one team that went undefeated outside of those 4. So from a betting perspective, this is how I look at it. If somebody pointed a gun to my head and said, what's Oklahoma's season record going to be this year in the regular season, I'd say, well, the probabilities say it's going to be 11-1, that they're going to trip up somewhere. Now, they are a substantial at this point, and it should carry through unless things go haywire. a substantial favorite in every game, but as we've seen year to year to year, they've tripped up once at least. So I think that the probability is that they're going to go 11-1, which is going to be a push for anybody who bets this over under, since it's not typically Vegas will put it on a half so that there is a distinction and there is a win or a loss either way, but it could be a push. I also think that the second highest probability is that they're going to go undefeated. That would be my second choice, that they're going to go undefeated. And then third would be 10-2, of course, and then on down the line. So yeah, I think it's a fair spread. I would like to see Vegas put that on a half just to create the tiebreaker, but they know what they're doing in terms of crunching the numbers. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you, Mark, exactly from a probability standpoint. I think a couple of things that kind of come to mind and the probabilities from, when you look at 11-1 at 10-2. First of all, if Oklahoma goes 10-2, there's going to be a massive disappointment just overall from a program perspective. 10-2 probably, may still get them a Big 12 championship, at least at a spot in the Big 12 championship game, but certainly out of the playoff discussion. So I think you kind of stop that there. But then when you look at 11-1, I think kind of looking at the expectations for Oklahoma, if it's a loss to Texas, if it's a loss to Iowa State, I think obviously there's still disappointment there, but I think that's easier to handle given how highly ranked coming into the season and how good both of those teams would probably be. But if there's a loss, heaven forbid, to Kansas State again, or if there's a loss to a Baylor, if there's a loss to a Texas Tech or somebody like that, then I think you have to start looking at that as a trend at this point with, Oklahoma not getting up, not being ready for some of those lesser opponents. And Mark, I think that's a mark of a championship team, in my opinion, is, being able to, these games. I heard a coach one time say that, college football players, they'll get up for games probably 7 out of 10, just looking at 10 games, 7 out of 10 games in the season. There's those 3 games that are kind of going through the motions, and how are you able to, if you have a game that you're kind of going through the motions, not extremely excited to be out there competing, how do you get through that and get a win in those games? So yeah, I think I'm right on with you. I think number 1 is 11-1, number 2 is 12-0, and number 3 is 10-2. But I think with the amount of expectations that Oklahoma has on them this year, anything less than 11-1 would be considered extremely disappointing.
And just to further your point about the circumstances under which they would lose that game and what it would do to them in the national championship race, obviously it doesn't work within a silo. So what else is happening in college football with the other conferences? We won't address that. But to your point, okay, who did they lose to? What did that team do the rest of the season? So if they lose to Texas and Texas goes 7-5, that doesn't look great. But if Texas doesn't lose to anybody else or goes 10-2 and they lost to, Texas, and it was a number 2 point, a close game, did they lose by a field goal, or did they lose like they did a couple of years ago to Kansas State, who really put a number on them, like 45-23 or something in that range? So that's a factor. What did it look like? That cost Ohio State a playoff spot 2 consecutive years, not just that they lost to Iowa and Purdue. They got blown out unexpectedly. Number 3, as Oklahoma benefited from a couple of years ago in that comparison against Ohio State, they got to avenge their loss. So the beauty of the Big 12 is that you play everyone, and if that team that beat you is good enough to then rematch in the championship game, then you get that opportunity if you lose that game, as they did against Texas, to come back and show, okay, we can right the wrong, and we just went back and beat that same very team.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Mark, Oklahoma's had the benefit of doing that twice with Texas, as you mentioned a few years ago, and then Iowa State last year. I think and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we've had a 2-loss team make it to the playoffs since the inception of the playoffs. I know that there's been a few years ago where I think LSU was had lost 2 games in the regular season, and they ended up making it to and this was during the BC.
Well, some of us think that's what it was. I've certainly outlined that, but
yeah, under the BCS, they had made it to the national championship game with 2 losses. I remember one of the weirdest seasons that we've kind of had in college football, where we had a 2-loss team. But yeah, I mean that's well. That point is well taken. I think you see a team like that have the opportunity to avenge their loss is a good opportunity to get themselves back into that conversation for the playoff. But I think it's a maturation for a team that many believe that this is the best overall Oklahoma roster that they've had since the early 2000s. When you talk about offense and defense and people, what they brought back and what they've brought in from a transfer portal perspective.
Yeah, and also keep in mind that people will note that a 2-loss team has never made the college football playoff, but we had one particular year in which we know that a 2-loss team would have made the college football playoff. So that was 2017. Auburn had 2 losses. They were in the top 4 with 2 losses. They lost the SEC championship game. So they were securely in the spot, and then having defeated another top team, we know that they wouldn't have been dropped out of the top 4. So it can happen. It's very unlikely. It hasn't happened in 7 years, but there was a scenario in which it was right there for Auburn to take it with a 2-loss record into the playoff. So yeah, I'm rooting for chaos. We've had that conversation a few times here recently, and you would like to see some I took calls last night, Jason, and this is the only way I can really frame it is we were talking about the excitement of game day on Saturday, and just that college football, in my opinion, can't be replaced. It just can't be topped. That Saturday from noon till midnight of just, it never disappoints. There are games across the country that are just ridiculously entertaining, and they're crazy and they're great. And then you add in the pageantry and the cheerleaders and the bands and the traditions and the rivalries and all of it, the spectacle, and then the play on the field. It's not the NFL. It's not the top level. There's no comparison between the NFL and college football if you're just looking at which game is a better game just sheerly on the field, who makes less mistakes, who's better. Well, sure, that can't be debated because there's only this portion of college football players that move on to the NFL. The quality of the play is better in the NFL. But if you're just talking about sheer excitement and then everything that surrounds the game that makes it even more exciting, there's something to be said about the unpredictability of college football, that the players aren't quite at the level of the NFL players, that makes it even more exciting. There's more craziness that happens because they're not as good. But the 2 knocks I have on the sport is that, again, we've gotten into this place recently where that didn't exist for years and years and years. I produced 3 videos this week where I tracked where did the national champions start? Where were they ranked to start the season? Mm-hmm. Well, in 15 of the last 17 years, and all 7 playoff years, it was the top 5 in the nation. It was pretty predictable. Right. That didn't occur back in the 80s. We had unranked teams winning national championships and teams that started 18th and 22nd winning national championships. And then taking it the opposite direction, I looked at number 1 and number 2 preseason teams and where did they land? Mm-hmm. And again, you see this obvious trend during the 80s, especially, where there were a lot of preseason 1 and 2 teams dropping to 16, 18 in the country. Well, you never see that now because they're the same teams over and over and over, and they're finishing in the top 4 in the country. So I would like to see that. I would like to see, pardon me, Oklahoma fans, you're going to hate me for this, whether it's Iowa State or whether it's North Carolina or Texas A&M or Iowa, Wisconsin, somebody in the Big Ten, somebody break through and break this up a little bit. Or it would be tremendous if we had like 2 teams break through and really shake it up a little bit. Not just have one get in as the 4 seed and lose by 4 touchdowns and get bounced, but shake things up a little bit. And then the other thing is, unfortunately, while college football during the regular season doesn't disappoint, the playoff games and the better games, or what are supposed to be the better games, the bigger matchups, have routinely disappointed.
Yeah, they have, Mark. And I think, it's very interesting that I couldn't agree with you more on every single point that you made here. It's kind of interesting, kind of going back to your first point, really kind of talking about the game. I know that me and you and, college football fans across the country are certainly skewed in our view. But, it's kind of interesting. It was a conversation that my father and I were having, the other day about just sports in general. Like we're both really big sports fans, football, basketball, baseball, softball, like all across the board. We're all big sports fans, but but there's nothing to me that compares to to the Saturdays in the fall. We used to be season ticket holders for years and years and years, and to me, it got to the point where it was much more enjoyable being able to be at home and watch games, to your point of 11 a.m. to midnight Central Time. There's football on, and it's something that grabs your attention, at least from my perspective. Can just sit and watch game after game after game and enjoy it. But to your point on the playoffs, and I think this is like about the only logical reason that I can see against expanding a playoff is the playoffs we're already seeing tons of blowouts, and there's not always a ton of competitive games, especially in the one versus 4, 2-3 matchup overall. I had looked at some of that data, and I think around 70-75% of the playoff games that we've had since the playoff have been decided by 14 points or more. So I think when you see that, the thought of expanding the playoffs, that's the only kind of deterrent that I've seen that could be logical. But exactly to your point again, Mark, we're seeing the same teams over and over and over again. We mentioned the top 5: Oklahoma, Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, Ohio State. Obviously LSU's been there. We've seen Florida State there. We've seen Oregon there a couple of times. But we've seen Washington there. Trying to think if there's anyone I'm missing here that's been in the playoffs.
Michigan State.
Yeah, that's right, Michigan State. But by and large, there's not been more than 10 or 11 teams that have made it to the playoffs. So expansion really kind of allows that to happen. You get more opportunities. And we've talked about the mid majors, a group of 5 folks that really they don't have the stars have to align for them to make the playoffs. They don't have a really, obviously not a clear path. They don't have hardly any path at all. So I think being able to make that, and I'm with you, kind of minus the Big 12, but I mean I'm with you across the country. I think it would be exciting to see that. But we've talked about you talked a little bit about bets here. So let me just kind of throw one at you here from kind of a Power 5 perspective minus the Pac-12. So obviously the favorites are we have Oklahoma in the Big 12. We have Ohio State in the Big 10. We have Clemson in the ACC, and of course, we have Alabama. It's a little bit closer in the SEC, obviously, with Georgia and even maybe Florida to an extent. So if you had the opportunity, those four, let's just trim it down to the Big 12, the ACC, and the Big 10. What percentage of a chance would you give anybody except Oklahoma, Clemson, and Ohio State winning that conference this year?
I think Clemson has the tightest grip of the three. I think they have in the past, and they continue to. North Carolina's on the rise. Miami's decent, but Notre Dame was distinguished as the second best team in the league. Like, it wasn't even that close that Notre Dame was the second best team in the league, and then they got blown out by 4 scores in the ACC championship game when everybody was healthy. So I have the most confidence that Clemson's going to win the ACC, because I believe that the ACC is the weakest of the conferences. I think Iowa State's a formidable foe for Oklahoma. They're still a decided underdog, but they're formidable. And I believe that Texas probably isn't up to it, but from a sheer talent perspective, with a puncher's chance, maybe they've got a shot. In the Big Ten, I think there are a lot of really good teams. There's not necessarily a clear number 2 to say, okay, it was Penn State for a couple of years, but to say, okay, this is the challenger to Ohio State, but it's a much more balanced league than the ACC. It's got a second tier, Wisconsin, Iowa, possibly Michigan, Penn State level of teams that are capable. So there's actually more teams that could bring down Ohio State during the season. We just don't know who they are. It's like 4 or 5 teams that are pretty good. They're like top 15 type teams. So I think that exists in the other 2 leagues. But I think Clemson's got the biggest stranglehold on their league.
Yeah, no, I would agree completely. And then we've, in a couple of questions that we've had here. So specifically when you go back to Oklahoma, I think a big differentiator this year versus some of the last few years is strength of schedule, right? So this year, Oklahoma probably, you have Texas and you have Iowa State that's going to be ranked. It's kind of hard to see if any other teams that on their schedules are going to be ranked. I guess you could make a case that Nebraska could squeak in if they go 3-0 and they look impressive early on in the year. You could see where they could get there. You could see where West Virginia could get there at some point in the season. But, outside of that, the schedule is not strong. It is not formidable. There's not Ohio State there. There's not Houston a few years ago when they were really good, ranked in the top 25. They don't have a strong power kind of going into the season. So, maybe that makes a little bit of a difference in terms of what Oklahoma's been able to do in the past to kind of counteract that one loss to make it to the playoffs. And then the other thing that I kind of wanted to make just a quick comment on, Mark, if I could, is that there was a kind of a question around, or a comment made about, more runner-up trophies. And I think, and I'm not saying that that's incorrect, but I am saying, when you look at an eight teams, or what I've seen 8 teams and 10 and 12 teams, possibly being floated around from an expansion perspective. But I think it's more about the opportunity that some of these teams would get versus what's there now. The mid-major, that's more of a basketball term, the group of 5 folks. We talked about, like, Cincinnati is a team that they have the opportunity this year, but it only aligns, it only aligns ever so often for a group of 5, and it always is depending on how tough of a non-conference schedule they have with a team like Indiana and with a team like Notre Dame. you look at you look at those two teams where they're kind of projected to be. If Cincinnati is able to win those games, and I believe both of them are on the road, then certainly that's a big opportunity for them. But if they happen to lose one of those games, like, doesn't matter what else they do, they're out. And and even looking at the Pac-12 to some extent, right? You got a team like, I think Oregon or USC are probably certainly the two best teams, or most likely to make it to the to win that league. But does a Pac-12 team with one loss, do they make it to the playoffs versus looking at like an Oklahoma or a Georgia or a Alabama or whoever that might be with with one loss? Obviously those teams are going to get in over a Pac-12 team. So, like, even at that league, even with it being a Power 5, they have to have some things kind of go their way to make it up into the playoffs. So I think it's just more about opportunity and allowing teams. I mean, it's one of those things, Mark, when you think about going into a season knowing that you have very little or sometimes even no opportunity, no matter what you do, to play for a championship. So I think for me, that's the biggest argument that I have against keeping it the way it is.
Yeah, if we played 10 more years of the playoff, and let's say we expanded it to 8 or 16 tomorrow, and over the next 10 years, we still had the same 4 or 5 teams competing for the national championship, winning all the playoff games, I would still think it was worth the expansion. And this is why. It's exactly what Jason's talking about. It's about opportunity. So right now, we have a sport that's built largely on perception. So you mentioned the Pac-12. If the Pac-12 goes out and takes care of you can't expect a league to go out and win all its non-conference games and just totally change the narrative and win all its non-conference games. Let's say, reasonably speaking, the Pac-12 plays better out of conference than they have. The Pac-12, we go into this season where in all other sports, the objective results on the field dictate who makes the playoffs, not, well, we don't think the Pac-12's that good, so they're going to have to prove it. Well, how can they prove it? They only have a limited opportunity. UCLA's playing a game against LSU. Well, LSU may be an 8-4 team.
Right.
There's just limited opportunities. So you got to fight through all this perception that happened in previous seasons that should not come into play or be taken into consideration. Number one. Number two, these that there's less number of games played in college football than in any other sport. These leagues play only 3 to 4 games outside the conference. Most of those are taken up by group of 5 and FCS games and bottom of the league Power 5 matchups. There are very few non-conference games in college football that give us results that we can make some type of evaluation on. Therefore, these leagues play in silos.
Mm-hmm.
So every league should be represented in this playoff. I don't care how bad we think they are. I've been hearing for the last 3 or 4 years that the Pac-12 is so awful and we get killed in the playoff. Mm-hmm. Well, the only 2 examples we have is that Oregon made a playoff the first year and they advanced to the championship game. And Washington went 2 years later in 2016 and played a pretty respectable game against Alabama. It was a 10-point game in the fourth quarter. They weren't up to the challenge. They weren't that good, but they were playing the number 1 team in the country. Yeah. That's all we have out of the Pac-12. They've shown up twice and they've proven to be pretty respectable. But all we've heard over the last 3 or 4 years is that they're going to get blown out, so leave them out.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. No, I couldn't agree with you more, Mark. And I think that one of the arguments that you hear about expanding the playoffs again is watering down the regular season. And for me, when you look at all sports, even when you're looking at professionally versus collegiate, and when you're looking at all the different sports, I think, and of course, like you, I'm sure you're biased as well, but I think the college football has the best regular season of any sport, and I don't really even think it's particularly close. I think it's the most exciting. It's the most, it's the most pressure packed, season. When you think exactly to your point about the Pac-12, like a lot of those teams, when you're looking at from the upper echelon of the Pac-12, specific. I think USC. I think we would agree. USC and Oregon are probably the prohibitive favorites going into the season. Arizona State's there, but I think those are the favorites that would certainly be ranked high enough to be in a position to make the playoffs. But think about the enormous pressure that both of those teams, those schools have as they go through the season. They know, their coaches know, the administration know that they're basically going to have to be perfect to make a playoff spot, and even then they might be scrutinized a little bit because of the strength of schedule. I mean, your point about UCLA is well taken about who knows how good LSU is going to be when they play them on September 4th. But so with that, I think it does. I don't think it does anything to water down the regular season. I mean, you can make an argument that it can even make it better from a regular season perspective, because those games, some of those games, like, they mean more. I mean, I saw something interesting when there was there's a lot of, I think here in July, we'll hear some stuff from the committee about, some things that maybe they're looking at from a format perspective going forward. And I've seen some comments, like, for instance, when you're thinking of the American Conference, which I think we agree is clearly the best group of five conference out there. There's a lot of casual football fans that probably wouldn't necessarily care to watch Cincinnati and UCF. Now you expand this to 8, and the winner of this team or winner of this game, how much is the intrigue going to go up? And not necessarily just that. There's some, when you think about whatever the format looks like. I mean, I think a lot of people think if there's 8, you got the 5 automatic bids from a Power 5 conference, and then you have maybe a group of 5 selection and a couple of wild card selections. But what does that, when you think of a wild card selection, what does that also look like on Championship Saturday when you have let's just say you have an Alabama and a Georgia, and the Georgia's, loses that game by a field goal, they still, they're still good enough to make the playoffs, but since they've lost 2 or maybe even 3 at this point, then they're certainly out of the equation. So yeah, I think there's a lot of more intrigue that it would bring to the regular season and the championship weekend as well.
Yeah, so I want to address the comment on the screen and then also extend Jason's point, because that is the common argument against the playoff, is that it's going to cheapen the regular season and there are going to be games that don't matter. And what I am thinking is that whether it's 8 or 16 teams, that you're going to have, let's take, for example, Clemson, that they're sitting there at 10-0. They've got 2 regular season games left. We know that a 10-2 Clemson team that wins the ACC championship game is going to get to the playoffs at 11-2. So why not? They sit their starters, they don't play, whatever. Okay, yeah. I understand that point. Those instances, first of all, are going to be so limited. Right. If we would go through college football year to year to year, and I've looked at it, those instances would, number one, be so limited. Number two, they could be prevented to a large degree by playing on-campus games the first round of the playoffs. Mm-hmm. So Clemson, you can go ahead and do that if you want to do that, if you feel secure that you're going to go into the ACC championship game with a 2-game losing streak, win that game, and be fine at 11-2. But do you want to go to Madison, Wisconsin, or Seattle, Washington, and play a first-round playoff game? Well, if that's a decision you're making, that's fine. You have forfeited your home game because you're going to drop in the rankings, and you're going to have to go play mid-December in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or somewhere for a playoff game, number one. Number two, to Jason's point, both in the group of 5 and in the Power 5, for the couple games that might be slightly tainted. Okay, Alabama's 10-0. Are they really going to show up? They don't need to win this game this week. There's going to be dozens of games that are going to be relevant all of a sudden, that before were just nice games between 8-2 teams, or 7-1 and 8-2, and they're just, they're decent teams and they're ranked 12th and 10th, and that's a good matchup and a nice game, but neither one of these teams is going to make the playoffs. Right. Well, suddenly, the winner of this game has a shot to make the playoffs. Like, there's going to be many more of those instances in which games are going to become relevant. Okay. So that's my 1 point. And then looking at the screen, Shawn says, OU has plenty of perception. 0-4 college football playoff games. Most college football world knows. Says OSU has gotten embarrassed all 4 times. Okay. Well, number one, they haven't gotten embarrassed all 4 times. When you take a team to overtime in a college football playoff game, that's not getting embarrassed. So anyway, the other games, yes, to a certain extent. But why is this the only sport where we hold years and years of results against a team? This 2021 Oklahoma team that marches out onto the field in week 1, they're going to be the only 2021 Oklahoma team. They shouldn't have to carry the burden of what happened in 2015 against Clemson or 2018 against Alabama. Why do we? This is the only sport. We don't go to the NFL playoffs and say, the Chargers got blown out the last 2 years in the playoffs. They shouldn't be here. Let's keep them home. Right. The NCAA selection committee doesn't even say, let's keep out A, B, and C because, they lost the last 2 years by 20 points in the first round of the NCAA tournament. So let's leave them out.
Yeah.
No, let's evaluate the teams on what happens this season.
Right. I mean, it's when you think about it from the outside, it's a little bit coach speak when you kind of think every year is a new year. We start off with a blank slate, but it's really the truth here, and I wouldn't say, I mean, in 2 of those games, yes, Oklahoma got embarrassed by, and you could even make an argument that it was really just one. Obviously the LSU, the last one that they had, LSU, they were out of that from the beginning. So, that one, the Clemson game, they were ahead at halftime, 17-6 or 17-16. They had a couple of things did not go their way. There was a fake field goal. I think it was a fake punt where they kind of changed the momentum in that game. And then when you look at the Alabama game, they end up losing by 11. I believe it's 45-34. Obviously, they got off to the bad start, but 11-point loss to an Alabama team, I don't think I would consider that as an embarrassment. So, truly, I think there's only one that I would say a true embarrassment from a blowout perspective, as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think that national perception, I think it's there. So from Shawn's perspective, I think it's there not from an embarrassment perspective. I think it is there from a just overall not being able to get the job done perspective. So, we talked about it's very critical for Oklahoma to win that playoff game. And to your point, Mark, yes, it is a new year. There's none of those players were around in the, for the 2015 game, obviously, are against Clemson, or even the 2017 game against Georgia. But yeah, I think it's certainly it's important for Oklahoma to kind of take that next step and win a playoff game. But one last point that I kind of wanted to make, in one of the things I was kind of looking up, in terms of the overall regular season playoff thing. So we've not really talked about this. I'm not sure what your kind of view on FBS versus FCS games in the regular season. And I think we agree that the regular season is the best, certainly the best regular season of any sport that there is. But when you think about this, I was kind of looking up this stat for this year in 2021, there are 117 games pitting an FBS team against an FCS team. And I understand the value from a monetary perspective that FBS or the FCS teams get from playing these games. And yes, from a lower tier FBS team playing FCS, it's a competitive game. But when you think about Oklahoma playing Western Carolina, you think about, and I don't have the schedule in front of me, I know that Alabama will play an FCS team as well. they get nothing. They get absolutely nothing out of those games. So one of the things that you could look at, if you have an expansion, you could kind of get rid of some of these FBS versus FCS teams, early on in the season, and you could create more marquee matchups when there's not as much pressure on. There's not as much pressure on going undefeated, or you can't lose more than a game to make the playoffs. You can be, a couple of, you could be a couple of losses in, and they could, certainly something could be worked out where there's a donation to the FCS teams or something, because I know that they use that to fund their program a lot of times through the remainder of the year. But there's not a lot of value. There's very little value on the field that we get as college football fans from those games being played.